Welcome back to Unmatched. My guest today is Cosmo Shield. Cosmo was a journalist at the BBC for 17 years until one day he decided to make his passion for writing a business. In this episode, Cosmo and I chat about how good copywriting needs to sit at the core of any marketing strategy and can make a brand truly unmatched. I hope you feel inspired by this conversation in the same way I was. Cosmo, it's great to have you today on the podcast. Thank you for coming.
Oh, it's great to be invited. Thank you so much. It's a real honor for me. So thank you.
The honor is all mine because you know that I've been following you for quite some time. So just to start on Cosmo, because I know your story, but I would love to hear it from you once again and for people to hear it directly from you. What's your story and what do you do today?
So today I actually run my own B2B content and copywriting agency. But for almost 20 years before that, I was a journalist at the BBC. So probably when I was like 12 or 13 years old, I sort of realized that I had this kind of natural ability as a storyteller and could connect people to ideas and sort of translate ideas into stuff that people found quite engaging. So really like journalism was a kind of natural progression for me. And so I went to join the BBC when I was 21 and was really lucky because actually BBC is sort of seen as the pinnacle. And so I sort of felt, quite lucky at the time to join the organization, and then progressed through the ranks and became less of a journalist and then more as a manager. So I ended up actually managing quite a big team, about 25 people. And I sort of started to reassess what I actually wanted from life because it felt like I'd been working in one job for a long time. And obviously I'd sort of just thought that there was possibly something else that I wanted to do. And then obviously the pandemic hit. And so I started my business. I was still working full time while I was doing it, which was a serious, it took a lot of effort, obviously, as you'd imagine. And then eventually made the decision. So got a few clients, made the decision that I would try and go part-time initially and then quit the BBC. And I'm sort of really excited about what's next, really. I feel like the hard yards were like the first 6 months, the first year when you've got no clients and you've got no confidence, you don't know any of the processes, you don't know what you're doing. You think you've got a sort of skill that people might want to pay for, but you don't really know. And I'm not like a natural salesperson. I sort of never felt that. So I'm excited for what's next.
Sure. Before we get into all that, what I was actually curious to know, going one step back, is how do you become a journalist? What were the skills in your childhood that led you to become this storyteller? And how was your childhood? And also, what were the things that you loved doing that sort of propelled you into this journey?
I think the main thing really that I would say for anyone who's thinking about that as a career or even just in your everyday life, I think curiosity was kind of my main skill. It's just a curiosity of how does the world work, and not just curiosity about the world, but also what motivates people. And I think that's now a very foundational thing of the skill set of a copywriter. And then being able to absorb complex information and being able to create output that is simple and people can understand. And I think everyone's too scared to keep things really simple. And I think that's the lesson I would give to anyone who's sort of thinking about how to communicate better or whatever. It's simplicity and sort of aiming for universal understanding is a hugely important thing. And I think as well, this is nothing to do with journalism, but humor has always been a massive thing for me.
So 17 years at the BBC are a lot of years, and I'm really curious. It must have been a lot of learnings, in your career, progressing as a journalist, becoming who you are today. And I'm curious to know, what were the biggest learnings for you in those times at the BBC, and also just being a journalist and what that meant to you?
Had a huge bearing on my life, and it was very much what I wanted to do from when I was 12 years old, and it's still very much the foundation really of who I am, and I'll never lose that interest in how the world works and the kind of human motivation element. And I'd sort of break it down, I think, into sort of two parts really in terms of what I've learned when I was a journalist, because my career was kind of in these two parts. The first part was very much pure journalism, a radio producer, digital producer, kind of creating original stories, going out and finding stories, the sort of resilience that you need to do that, and the sort of instincts that you build up over that time as to like what is a story, what's engaging for people, etc. And then like a leadership role, motivating people. So coming in at 4:30 in the morning with pretty much a blank canvas, like some of the programs fixed up, but you've got you're ready to go. You have a team of like 5 people there in the morning, and you've got to like go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in like no time at all. Understanding that and like understanding how to get people to work to deadlines, I think was so important. And I think you often hear journalists talking about kind of the newsroom mentality and the doggedness to get something to deadline or something on air or whatever at the time. And that will always stay with me. And I think that's like, some people, you sink or swim in that environment, and I just loved it and I embraced it. And I definitely miss that now that I'm sort of working by myself. Like, it's a completely different world, but journalism has given me so much, like, and I will always be indebted to the BBC. And I see a lot of people hating on the 9 to 5 and like hating on organizations, and the only thing you should do is go out and build your own business and go be a solopreneur or whatever. And I think it's just complete nonsense in a way. Like, I think everyone should have their own experience of both and like make decisions. There's no right or wrong. Some organizations can be absolutely brilliant, and also like you've got the upsides and the downsides on both sides. So like I would always say that the BBC was probably the best sort of moment of my career in terms of like at the moment, and it's the foundational element, and it stands me in good stead for what's next, really, I think.
And it's interesting what you're saying, because I relate to that as well. I think a lot of people are talking about entrepreneurs and solopreneurs and all that, and I think there's a little bit of a mess on the entrepreneurs, right? Like the people that work inside organizations and have entrepreneurial spirit. Because let's face it, not everyone can be an entrepreneur, but a lot of people have entrepreneurial spirit. And that is very, very useful inside organizations as well. So I think you're right. There is a lot to learn inside big organizations. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of experiences that you can have that you can't have on your own, and there's a lot of learning that comes along with it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the organizations that really like encourage that in their people. Those will be the ones that will thrive in like the next generation, because an organization isn't really in competition with like other organizations anymore. Like, it's in competition with the people themselves going out and doing their own thing and taking their skills elsewhere. And I think that organizations shouldn't be scared of that, because you shouldn't think about the fact that you have some ownership over your employees, or that like you shouldn't feel betrayed if they think about moving elsewhere or whatever. Actually, like, just be glad that you've had a great experience with them working for you for a period of time, and get the most out of them, and then look to see what's next as well. The organizations, I think, that have like the more fixed mindset of like, that they don't encourage that kind of thing, that's where the problem comes, I think, and will come for organizations in the future.
I completely agree with you. And you mentioned curiosity before. And a lot of people, I think, me included, have this natural curiosity. And natural curiosity sometimes stands in the way, right? Because obviously in organizations, there are, jobs and titles, and everyone needs to do their own part. And how do you develop this natural curiosity within an organization? So I'm curious to know, what was the aspect of this curiosity that you naturally have that led you to say, okay, 17 years, 18 years at the BBC are enough, and now I want to take the plunge into complete abyss.
That's an interesting way of
Not
framing it.
knowing.
I think if I'd thought about it in those terms, I probably wouldn't have done it. But yeah, and I understand exactly what you mean. Yeah, of course. It's the
But
unknown,
probably
right?
it was,
The
right? In a
unknown.
way,
Yeah.
it was, because you said it yourself. It's the unknown, and it's like living something that is there, and it's very, comfortable, and it's reassuring, and it's all that in a way. And then deciding to do something completely different that is completely out of your scope, but it's linked to your skills. What was the thing that actually motivated you to take that, leap forward?
So actually, if I'm being honest, for a few years before that, I'd really started to think I just don't like telling people bad news anymore. And that was kind of what the job was, because of 24-hour news, because of the world we live in, that sort of it bleeds, it leads kind of mentality, like that's the newsroom sort of cliche, is completely true. And just felt like I was doing that constantly. Like we were constantly just being the doom mongers, and that was really affecting my mental health as well. And it was just like a bit of a culmination of things. And I just thought there's got to be something else to this. I'm not the sort of person who goes out encouraging people to quit their job, and you do whatever you want to do. And like the organizations and 9 to 5 jobs are great for lots of people, and not everyone wants to go off and do their own thing, and that's absolutely fine. But I think people think about the risk of doing that in the wrong way. People build up this like huge risk in their mind of like, oh, I can't quit this job, it's a fixed salary and all the rest of it. And actually, in reality, you will probably have got to the point when you're trying to make these decisions that you've built up a skill set, you've built up experience, you are probably very employable, and actually you can try something, and if it doesn't work out, like you'll probably get another job again. Literally, the amount of people who said to me as I was leaving the BBC, well, you can always come back. And I was like, no, I really don't want to come back. Like, this is me now. But I think that people think about the risk in the wrong way. Like, they think they only focus on the negatives. There are positives there, and if the positives don't work out how you plan them to work out, then you can just carry on and you can rejoin the status quo, and you can kind of carry on your 9 to 5, and actually, nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, and one thing leads to another, and one step leads to the next, and then, like here you are today, a full-on entrepreneur,
Well,
right?
yeah, that still kind of sits quite uneasily on me, like as a thing. I was actually doing a bit of research, just thinking about the term entrepreneur, and I had sort of never really put it together with the French expression, and colloquial translation of it is adventurer. And I quite like that as a thing, right? I'd rather call myself an adventurer than an entrepreneur. I think an entrepreneur is quite a loaded term. I sort of definitely now see, and I'm much more into like the adventure of life than I was before. It's taken that leap to make me think a bit more, broadly about why we're here and kind of, what I actually want to do with my life.
So before getting into the actual topic of copywriting, I want to know what's the biggest mindset shift from going to that very protected environment that you left to this adventure, right? That is literally throwing you into the unknown. What was the mindset shift that you need to go through in order to be able to do this?
It was actually just a moment where I listened to a podcast, How I Made My First Million, or like the Sean Puri podcast. He's like an entrepreneur, investor in the States, like really interesting guy, like got a big Twitter following. And he talked about this thing called the ABZ framework instead of like the ABC framework. And he basically said that everyone's too obsessed with the how in your life. Like all you need to know really is the A, which is like where you are now, the B, like what's the next step, and the Z, which is your vision. And I really like that as a sort of framework, because I was just kind of like thinking, I've always up to that point been like an A, B, C, D, E kind of like systems thinker. I always want to know like what that next step is. And so my sort of philosophy now is very much like, I don't need to know the how. Like all I need to know is the why and the what's next. If I set myself a goal, or I set myself a sort of objective. So for me, it was like, leaving my job and starting a business and all the rest of it that goes along with that. That actually like I had enough confidence in my own ability that actually like I could create a bit of motion and like get intentional and start creating stuff on LinkedIn and almost visualizing me having my own business or whatever. And actually then the rest sort of takes care of itself. Like it feels a bit glib to say that, but it's people's potentials are held back so much by thinking that you need to know every step, whereas actually in reality you just need to know a bit more about yourself, and then your end point, and then kind of like the C, D, and the E and the F, and everything sort of will take care of itself if you head in the right direction with sort of energy and focus. After listening to that particular podcast, it was just like a really interesting kind of shift for me mentally, and I just suddenly thought, actually, I don't need to know everything. It's fine not to know, and actually embrace the uncertainty, I think is important.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I think my mindset now is also a little bit like that, this A, B, and Z, and it implies having a vision for yourself and understanding your why and your purpose. And I'm wondering, where do you think this is coming from, though? Do you think it's a matter of generation? Is it a generational thing, or is it simply a matter of experience, of life experience, that takes you to this point where you don't need it to be so clear and sort of laid out in front of you? Or is it because we're used to working in big companies where sort of everything, all the process needs to be laid out, because, you know, obviously it's a huge machine and it has a lot of components and you need to make it work by making all the components sort of work at the same time? Where do you think that comes from in your case?
Well, I sort of experienced, I think, like good and bad managers and leaders. And I think that you learn a lot from both. But like what I was actually reflecting on the other day was just probably like I got a lot of like energy and confidence when I was starting out thinking about my own business and creating it, just by looking at like what really young people were doing on LinkedIn, particularly. There's definitely like a shift in terms of the Gen Z are sort of seem to be way more like entrepreneurial minded, like way more kind of do it yourself minded. And I think that's probably come from the access to the platforms that they have. And you know, if we compare to, you know, I'm never going to presume your age, but I'm guessing we're sort of a similar age, that when we started out, there wasn't much. And then you're on like, you know, MySpace and all the rest of it. And obviously like, but growing up digitally native, I think you sort of have a completely different perspective on what's possible, because actually you can essentially just create an agency in your parents' like spare bedroom and then, you know, talk about it on social media, and then next day you're like a 6-figure agency. I think like that, and that is possible. I know there's a lot of like BS that goes around and people are like sort of, you know, painting a bit of a sort of maybe a bit of a fantasy picture of their lives, but actually that's definitely possible. And so I think that is like a really interesting shift that's happened. And I personally have learned a lot from sort of watching those generation and kind of getting that confidence from it. But, you know, in terms of like organizations, there's clearly like a vested interest, particularly like with managers, particularly of like keeping the status quo as it is. I mean, obviously there are always great maverick leaders who, you know, completely try and disrupt everything inside organizations and whatever. And that's obviously where the sort of power of entrepreneurial spirit comes in. But I think a lot of businesses are laden down with like these really archaic processes that people have vested interest in keeping going. So, you know, I think that's important. And I think the organizations that really like will thrive in the future are those that actually encourage those Gen Zers and probably the generation that go after them to be part of the organization and really like explore all of their potential inside the organization and not allow the processes and everything to kind of get in the way. You know, I think that's the biggest thing, really.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Now, talking about copywriting, how do you land on specifically talking about copywriting? Out of everything that you've done with your career, and being a journalist implies a lot of different things, right? You could have been a producer, you could have been, I don't know, you could have tried to do something completely different. Why copywriting?
Copywriting is an interesting term, I find. Like, and again, it's quite loaded in like what it is. And I think a lot of people who claim that they're doing it on like social media are not really doing copywriting at all. When I started out, my sort of image of copywriting was basically like Mad Men and, you know, Eugene Schwartz and like all of that kind of really old, like, you know, the sort of direct response sort of generation. And obviously copywriting's evolved a lot since then. But I think like that actually people should just really just talk about writing, you know, just generally. I mean, I think like my business now is not really kind of copywriting in the sense of like landing pages and other things. You know, mainly what I do actually is writing content, and that is like thought leadership content, however it is. And that's kind of, I guess, where the journalism sort of comes in. But I've always just loved writing. People go, oh, you know, videos, why is that's not really writing? And I would say like, actually the best video production or video marketing or whatever has like great copy that's sort of underpinned it. And pretty much everything, when you start thinking about it, has writing like in it somewhere. And also like what I actually got a bit, you know, not on a mission about, but like it's just how bad like corporate communications are and how rubbish people are at writing emails and, you know, just the basics of writing. And I just thought that is probably my core skill if I boil down like everything that I've got Storytelling, yeah, of course, all those sort of things, but they're quite abstract in a way. Actually, like writing as an ability is hugely important, and I really believe that like anyone can basically learn to write better, and so that's what drove me at that point to start the copywriting business. But then also then it will like develop into other things that I want to do in the future. But actually I'll credit you, Oana, actually, because we had a conversation probably about 4 months ago or something, and I was sort of like on a bit of a, at that point I was kind of, I mean, this is the beauty of having your own business. You can have like lots of different directions and you can work out where you're going, and like you don't, the thing you started off doing doesn't have to be the thing that you eventually do, whatever. And so I was sort of working with like lots of coaches on LinkedIn, and I was sort of setting myself up as a bit of a LinkedIn coach, and it just didn't feel authentic to me at all. But it was kind of working, like I was getting clients and I was sort of like, you know, it was sustaining. So sometimes it's hard to say no to the money. And then we had a conversation, I think it was the first time we'd spoken actually, and you were kind of learning a bit more about me and what I did, and like you'd probably seen like how passionate I was about writing, and you were just like, you just gotta double down on like LinkedIn. You've just got to get in there and start talking about your writing more and like really pushing that side of the business. And I was just like, yeah, you're totally right actually, because I wasn't really on LinkedIn at the time. I was kind of just like talking about, you know, growth tips, and it was just didn't feel authentic to me. And so actually I give you a lot of credit for having that moment really about 4 or 5 months ago where I sort of like went, right, well, this is probably the direction I want to go in. And so since then kind of things have developed. But yeah, thank you for that.
You're very welcome. And I want to say the reason why I got in touch with you in the first place is because I feel like writing seems to be this topic that people seem to think that is only something for the copywriters. You know, in big organizations, you know, obviously you have marketing, you know, teams, and then within those teams you have specific roles that are assigned to copywriters. And it seems to be to me the fact that, you know, writing is not something that is only for the copywriters. Writing is something that all of us should be doing, and not only doing for ourselves but also doing in order to share, right? And the reason why I started to engage with you is because you were talking about exactly those things, and I got interested in the topic of actually how do you learn to write properly, right? And as a marketer and as a strategist, you'd think, well, I don't necessarily need to do the writing myself. That's why I have the copywriters for. But in order to be an end-to-end marketer, an end-to-end leader in any scope, I think writing is a very, very important aspect. And I'm curious to know your opinion on how you see writing in the business context, and how important you think that is for any department in a company, not just, you know, marketing or internal communications or anything like that.
I mean, it's completely foundational, I think, and it's always been important, but I think probably hasn't got the attention and the sort of credibility that it deserves as a sort of as a tool. The thing I was thinking about the other day is actually when you send a text to someone, like you're writing, and it's kind of like copywriting in a way. I mean, like obviously you're just, you know, some of it's just throwaway, or like, you know, you're just keeping like the kids up to date with what you're doing, or you're just telling your parents something, or whatever it is. But actually, you know, a lot of the time you might be like persuading someone to do something, or, you know, you are like, you know, trying to make them laugh, you're trying to engage them, you're trying to educate them in some way. So that's a text message, and that's writing, but we don't think about that in those terms. And I think exactly the same on sort of social media, and particularly like writing the best email that you can write in a corporate environment is so important. Like I remember managing quite difficult people at points, and I think we've all had that experience. And I would put loads of effort into face-to-face and doing loads of feedback and really listening and just generate, you know, building trust and all the rest of it. And then I might get back to the desk and I might be a bit tired, a bit busy, a bit stressed or whatever. And I'll send an email without thinking about it. And that email then would land really badly and would undo all of the hard work. And I think that's a lesson in like how important like writing is in terms of like the way we communicate with each other at work. And I think it's generally like so executed so poorly. Like people don't think about what they're writing. They don't think about what they're trying to get out of an email. You know, they might spend ages preparing for a presentation, and then they might send like a really waffly like email to the CEO that just completely like sets things off on the wrong foot. I think that's hugely important. I'm sort of in conflict about whether I call myself a copywriter. I sort of just like, I'm probably more of a content writer, if anything. But the lack of respect that copywriters get in an organization generally, like having worked now with various marketing departments and like, etc. Like I know that there's a lot of talk on LinkedIn about copywriters getting like 6-7 figure businesses, etc. And of course that's possible. But like a sort of decent copywriting job in a marketing department or whatever in the UK, you're not making a lot of money. Like it's not like you get the big bucks or whatever, but actually it's such an important like foundation for the creative process. Like, and it's often the thing that actually sells the product. I think that's the thing that people forget, that actually you can have all the best like creative and amazing branding and all the rest of it, but actually it's words that move people. And so like I don't think copywriters get enough credit in organizations, and I would definitely like to change that. And I think, as you say, it's important for any senior leader to be really like thinking about how they are sort of writing and the way they project themselves, because so much of how we communicate is not face to face, especially now. And so much of it is kind of asynchronous, and you're trying to build like if you're at all savvy and you're like and you're sort of in a marketing team, you should be out there building your personal brand and building an audience and all the rest of it. And you can't do that without writing. So, that's the thing to think about. Even if you prefer video or, you find other ways to communicate and you don't just like, social, like you don't just sort of think like LinkedIn's a good place and you're not just writing loads of copy. Actually like writing and sort of generating your ideas and thinking about them is so important. And I think that's what I think we will see a lot more of actually is people like realizing that you don't have to be outside an organization building a business to be out on social building your brand. Like I think you can do that within an organization, and most organizations now are pretty welcoming of that. Like they want people to go out and actually become ambassadors and build brands, etc. I still don't think people have quite realized just how important writing is and how important it will be.
And you mentioned something very interesting, which is people inside companies becoming ambassadors, right? Working in a marketing department, obviously we're very aware of working with the influencers, and we have all sorts of ambassadors, from different fields, and that's absolutely critical to the business, and it's critical, consumer facing. But there's another layer to it, which is on these social platforms, whether are the personal platforms that you use to engage with your, family and friends and closer connections, or whether it's on LinkedIn where you have business connections. In the end, all those people are still consumers of the brand or the company that you work for. And so you automatically, whether you want it or not, directly or indirectly, you become an ambassador of the brand that you work for. So there's an opportunity there, in my opinion, for brands to look at that a bit more strategically and think of a safe and easy and probably very cost efficient, not to say for free completely, way of engaging with consumers in a different way by allowing the employees to speak on behalf of the company in a different way. But the question I wanted to ask you is, what is actually changing? Because I see a huge shift in mindset with a lot of leaders actually taking that sort of approach of seeing themselves as a brand and communicating to the outside world on a number of topics that are not just, simply business oriented, and here's me sharing something that I just launched, or here's a new product that we just launched without any explanation of it, and here's a link that we just reposted, or like as we used to do in the past. And there seems to be a major shift. Where is this coming from, and more importantly, where is this going?
Big questions. I think that definitely the kind of where it's coming from element is that people are just seeing that how successful other people are being doing the same thing. I think if you look at kind of, I don't know, the big influencers or the sort of big business thinkers who've got their own podcasts, who've got their own big LinkedIn profile or whatever, I think any CEO now has to be thinking and looking at that and thinking, well, why can't I do that? Or, I think what's sort of fundamentally shifting really in a way is like the appreciation that having an audience is like such a huge asset. And I think that no matter what you're trying to do. Like, and again, I think it's easy to get caught up in this, like, oh, everyone's going to quit the 9 to 5 and go out there and, like, start a business, etc. But, what you should just think about is, like, I should start just creating content, building a brand now, because it will stand me in good stead. Like, no time ever spent building a brand or building an audience has been wasted in my eyes. It's like, you will, just by shaking up that tree and, like, going out there and creating content and writing stuff and whatever your social platform of choice is. Like, I would say LinkedIn is always the best place, but, like, wherever you think, actually just by shaking that tree, like, you don't know what will happen. A great example is, again, like, I have a friend who doesn't post at all on social, or didn't post at all on social. Like, they're successful in their own right, and, at a senior level in a business, and was kind of, like, constantly needling me about, like, sending me messages going, all I ever see on LinkedIn is your content, etc. And, like, I'm sure you have this as well, Moana. Like, it's the same for anyone
I'm
who's,
the only person
yeah.
coming up on everybody's feed,
Yeah.
apparently.
Yeah. And
Which is scary.
yeah, exactly. I mean, the pressure's on at that point, right?
Yeah.
And he just said, oh, well, it's not that hard, is it, creating this content? Like, can we have a chat about it, and I'll create something. So I sort of, like, was just talking him through the basics, and gave him a couple of ideas, whatever, and he went away and I posted some stuff. And then literally, like, 2 days later, a guy got in touch with him and said, we really want you to be a non-exec director of, like, our business. And so it's literally just from, like, posting on LinkedIn, that opportunity happened to him. And it's like, well, actually, that shows you this sort of infinite power that's there. And actually, you just need to join that game and find out, like, what's in it for you. And there will be loads in it for you. It's just overcoming that initial fear, I think, and the kind of hurdle. And businesses particularly, I think, thinking about that as a risk, like, thinking about encouraging our employees to go out there and start building their brands and creating, etc., is a risk for our business, rather than thinking this is a fantastic opportunity. I think that generally now, like, the risk, of course, there is still a risk. Like, you allow them to build a big audience and then they, disappear and, like, make their own living and monetize, etc. B, they say something awful, which then reflects badly on the business. Of course, those risks are still there, but actually, the upside to that is way more significant. You have this then high profile person in your business. I think what's interesting, what's happening now, and you're seeing it more and more, is that, like, distribution is absolute, like, king or queen, right? So I personally believe that in maybe 30 years, like, we won't necessarily have some of these huge household name companies that we see now, like, McDonald's. Well, like, Mr. Beast has just proved that, like, he can go out and basically create a burger chain, which, is the fastest growing burger chain in the US. I think these sort of conversations, it's like this shift is happening, that actually it's the personal brands and the individuals who actually, like, are now the gatekeepers in a way that organizations and businesses used to had the monopoly on for so long. So it's like, that's interesting now, is sort of seeing that shift happening. And I think it will happen in our lifetimes, like, that those sort of organizations will become less relevant, and the personal brands will be absolute king or queen. So, let's see. So that's probably where I think it's going to go next. And it's already happening a lot, but I don't think people have quite realized, like, what a seismic transition that will be. That's, I think, is really interesting and important to keep an eye on.
Well, the other very obvious thing is, of course, you are doing it for yourself. I mean, let's be honest, right? In the end, you are building your own brand, you are supporting and you are being an ambassador for your company, but in the end, that face is yours and those words are yours, and it's your own opinions that you're putting out there. And I guess the question is, how hard is it to do it? I think one of the biggest questions that I get all the time is, when do you have time to do it all? And I always say, well, it's not that difficult, though. I mean, if you have a system in place and you know what you want to say, well, it's a matter of pure planning, and it's finding 30 minutes or 1 hour a week to just plan a few things that you want to post. And there's tools to help you. There's even AI copywriting. I don't know how big of a fan you are of that. So
We
there's
can talk
all
about
sorts
that in
of
a bit,
things.
because I've got some interesting things to say on that.
Yeah, definitely. But just enlighten us. if we decide to do it and if we want to spend this time, I think the big risk that companies sees, or the big thing that people are afraid of is, when do I find the time? Do I have time to work on what I need to work with? What is my day job? And when would I have time to do all this?
I think it's a very interesting conversation for organizations to have, especially if we are imagining in this world that, like, you know, organization X is going to encourage their employees to go out and create content on their behalf. You know, I think at that point then you have to, as an organization, build that time into the person's day. Like, you can't be expecting it to be all on their own time. I totally agree with you in the sense that, you know, you have a process, you have a system, you use scheduling tools. I think it's just a mindset shift that you go from being a sort of passive consumer of social media and a passive kind of consumer of ideas, really. So you're just kind of consuming passively, you're scrolling, whatever. You make that mindset shift from passive to active, and you actually say, right, I'm going to now be a creator and I'm going to create stuff. There are ideas everywhere, basically. I mean, it's, you know, anyone listening to this podcast now will probably have the habit of listening to podcasts. Like, I get so many ideas from podcasts. I mean, I sort of just hear like a line from someone and it sparks a thing, and I go to Notion and I add a quick line into my sort of, swipe file that I have. And then, like, when I then sit down, which I do generally on a Friday afternoon, and I'll write content for the following week, that's blocked out in my calendar. And, you know, I don't have any meetings at that time, and never, you know, always have that free for to do that. I think people get like too overwhelmed by this idea of like, you've got to have loads of finished posts and like you've got to have everything written. It's not that at all. Like, you just have to have triggers for ideas. And actually, once you start practicing and you start creating the content and writing or whatever other medium you have, you will start getting that feedback from the audience. You'll not understand what works, what doesn't, and you will just find it more natural. And I think it probably takes, you know, a good few months to get there, but I credit LinkedIn particularly, because that's the platform I'm most active on, with really like allowing me to start my business, to find my first clients, to essentially leave my job and, you know, do this full time. And I think without LinkedIn, it probably would have taken a lot of like, networking, like conversations and just going to events and pretty thankless things and spending lots of time doing stuff that I don't really like. But actually on LinkedIn, you have this it's like a fantastic broadcast platform where you can tell the world what you're doing. And if it has that perfect intersection between what someone needs, then you've got, you know, a ready-made sort of magnet to entice people in with your content. It's just so valuable to have that audience and to build that in the background, and that will go with you wherever. So that is the most important thing, really, is find the time to do it, or prioritize it, understand that it's important, find the time to do it, and then the rest you can learn as you go, really.
Yeah, and I think it's also the topic of intentionality, right? You mentioned before not being a passive user of social media or consumer, and becoming more intentional about what you put out there. And it's funny because I just recently watched this little clip of a singer, and he was talking, it doesn't matter who it was, he was talking about social media and Instagram, and he was saying, well, Instagram is basically just to promote my songs, and it's there for the purpose of sharing and promoting, and not for the purpose of putting selfies. And I think one of the biggest shifts for me has been, you know, when people ask me, well, when do you get the time? Well, it's like, well, you're spending time on social media, right? It's just that you're spending time scrolling and posting selfies and randomly commenting on other people, whereas I actually am not doing that anymore that much, and I'm actually just focusing on posting stuff that I think is interesting for other people. So it's just really the amount of time is probably the same, but it's just what you do with that time,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
what's the stat is like the average? I think it's in the US, but it's probably similar all over the world. It's like 4 and a bit hours, like a day, that your average person spends scrolling on social media. So, you
When you
know,
think about it, it's crazy
yeah,
the amount of time that we spend on social media, you know, and you can't just say, oh, it's for work. No, it's because you actually want to be there, right? But it's the what you're doing with that time, whether that time is productive or whether it's not, right? At the end of the day. And I think this is a mindset shift that we all should go through, because just the sheer amount of time that we actually dedicate to these platforms, and it's not just one platform, but multiple platforms is crazy, right? And so what do you do with that time? What do you decide to spend it on? Is it something productive or not?
I think as well that a lot of people, they scoff at, you creating content, or they kind of go, oh, that's not for me or whatever. But then they let like LinkedIn, or they let the platform like decide for them what kind of experience they're going to have and like what they're actually doing. Instead of scrolling on LinkedIn, particularly, like I just have, this might sound a bit geeky, but I have a spreadsheet with like all of my favorite creators and my people that I'm trying to kind of attract, my, leads and stuff. And I just go straight from that spreadsheet to their latest post. So I don't spend any time really like actually scrolling on the feed. And you're one of those people on the spreadsheet, Joanna. You'll be glad to know.
I'm honored.
So like I would definitely recommend that. I would say definitely like your first step before you even think about creating content, if you're not there yet, is actually just becoming better at using the platform and using on your terms. And that doesn't matter. It could be Instagram, it could be any TikTok, anything else. It's just working out what you want to get out of it, and then working out the best way of doing it for you, where you get your the maximum amount of leverage with the minimum amount of time. I think because that's, as you say, like time is the rarest asset you have, right? So I think that's the most important thing, is just be intentional, take control of your experience on social, and don't let the big Silicon Valley like social media companies decide what you're going to do with your life.
And also the other big component is coming back to the ABZ framework, is not just the intentionality, but the actual why of what you're doing in your life, right? Your purpose. You have established quite an interesting mission for yourself, which I'd love for you to talk about. But I also want to know, what's the bigger purpose for you as a person outside of that mission, which is maybe a bit more, professional, or professionally oriented. What's the bigger scope of the life purpose that you have nowadays? If you can share it.
Wow, I like it. I like it. We're going deep. We're going deep. My life purpose really is just to like put more into life than I expect in return. I think being kind to people and just being generous like is just such an important foundational thing, and it should be important in everyone's lives. And I think we all talk about how stressed we are and how it's sort of time poor and all the rest of it, and of course we are. But my thing has always been like, how do I give back, and like how do I mentor the next generation? Like how do I support that person in work that needs support? How do I cheerlead people on LinkedIn? Everything that I sort of do, really, I know it might sound a bit trite, but it's trying to use my sort of position, my standing, such as it is, to kind of help other people and just get people to a point that they might want to get to, whatever that is, really. And that does inform my kind of overall mission, or my sort of work mission in a way, which you touched on. Like what I want to do probably eventually is like have a sort of more of an education based business, where I'm actually helping people write better, in whatever format. So that could be in the kind of corporate world, it could be a small business owner trying to like come up with their a way of selling their business, or whatever. And so my mission is to transform how the world writes, but that feels massive. So my caveat to that is one person at a time. And it's like, it does seem to resonate with people. So I've sort of been talking about that a lot more on social media, and the amount of people who've kind of then reached out and said, oh yeah, that tip that you gave us like 6 months ago, I haven't written the same since. And I'm like, that is enough for me to get that validation. Like there's no money for me in that, really. There's no like, this person's not necessarily going to be a client or anything in the future, but actually something that I put out there a while ago has, changed how they write. Eventually, like I hope to monetize it, and I hope to, have a sort of educational business and course based and whatever else, so people can actually experience that on a wider scale. It comes from really of a place of like understanding quite how writing has sort of changed my life and how important I think it is. And how much I hear, like not just from friends, but also like former colleagues and people on social talk about it all the time. It's like that people think that they're not writers, and they sort of like describe themselves in such a way that, you know, they essentially, we've all heard it, that kind of expression of like, oh, writing's not for me, or I'm not a writer, or, you know, all of those sort of limiting beliefs that I think really do impact people. And I think it's such a foundational skill, as we've talked about, that you like have to be able to get better at it. And I 100% believe that everyone can get better at it. And actually it comes from practice, a bit of support, bit of guidance in the right direction. But it's sort of the thing that now drives me on. And it's not really got anything directly to do with my actual, you know, my agency really. It's just what, you know, gets me out of bed in the morning in a way. Like, you know, it's the thing that I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, and I have to say, I always brag now about the rule of three that I learned from you. And so every time I have a chance, I will name drop it and say, you know, like the rule of three, and I use it every time now. And I learned it from you. So definitely something that you should take credit for. You definitely teach us.
And if anyone's watching this or listening and doesn't know what it is, it's essentially like that our brains are hardwired to see patterns. And so three, for some reason, I like is very much a pattern. Like it's the first of like 1, 2, 3. It's like the first thing that where there's actually a pattern there that the brain recognizes. So you will often see it in like the best prose or the best, you know, speeches or whatever, that people will do that repetition. And it doesn't mean repeating the same thing 3 times. It's just like 3 things that are in alignment. And if you can incorporate that into your writing, like you will, you know, 10x your ability to kind of convince people to do things and your motivation and all the rest of it.
It's very powerful. And I have to say, I might use it a little bit too much these days because I got so fond of it. But tell me this. If you were to give 20-year-old Cosmo an advice or something, a tip that you wish you'd known at that time, what would that be?
For the longest time, actually, I sort of told myself the story like I'm not creative, I'm not that sort of person, like I'm more of can bring people together, and I understand patterns and I understand how organizations can kind of work and stuff like that. And this sort of then came down to this thing of like I needed to know at every point like what's next, like what's on that kind of next on that thing for me. And I sort of like would always think about my career in terms of a ladder. And this probably went on for, you know, at least 10 or 15 years. And obviously everyone gets to the point where they hit the plateau or the glass ceiling or whatever, and it just doesn't happen. And so the thing that I would say to me now when I was 20 is like just be clear on what you want from life, from your job, from career, and your personal life and everything else. And if you set off in that direction with like energy and focus, like the details will take care of themselves. And you don't have to worry about everything in between. And there is no like career ladder. It's all a myth in your mind. It's all made up. I probably think of it more like a roller coaster now that I'm sort of off doing my own thing. That would be my biggest advice. And for anyone else who's in that position now and they're thinking about it, that's the thing to think about, is that all the opportunities are out there. And, you know, you don't need to know every answer to every question, but actually, you know, do just sort of start things with energy and focus, and you'll be very, very surprised and probably delighted at where that takes you.
I just want to say thank you because you did transform at least one person's writing, which is me. And if I think about writing in a different way, it's also because of you. And I think you're going to do great. I think you're going to have an amazing journey. And this roller coaster is going to be a great one. And the adventure, I think it's going to pay off. So, you know, I wish you all the best. And I think, you know, you're going to do amazing things. I'm going to watch you from afar and always be there to cheer for you. And also, thank you for coming to the podcast. It was a really great conversation. And I'm taking a lot of tips away about how to improve my writing.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad. And, you know, it was a real honor to be invited. So thank you so much, Joanna.
Thank you for tuning into Unmatched. Remember, building an unmatched brand is not just about success. It's not about popularity. It's about creating something truly remarkable that reflects who you are and what you stand for. So keep pushing yourself to go beyond what you think is possible. Keep taking risks, challenging yourself, and never settle for standard. And if you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and follow us on social media to stay up to date on our latest episodes. Until next time, keep being unmatched.